Welcome to everyone. I'm thrilled to see so many people here for this very important event. I am Ruth Sandberg, and I am the director of the Certificate in Jewish Christian Studies at Gratz College, and I also teach in our adult education program. And I'm absolutely thrilled to serve as the moderator today for the program. I did want to take a minute to thank several people, aside from our three very busy speakers who are here today, and to thank them for their support. I would first like to thank Dr. Rosalie Guzovsky, who is now in the back of the library, who's our Dean and Vice President. She's really encouraged and supported this program, and I could not have proceeded without her support. I'd also like to thank Laura Hughes, who is also in the back of the library, who is our administrative assistant for special projects, and she took care of the hundreds of details that are involved in a program like this with patience and diligence. And I also wanted to thank Mindy Cohen from our development office for assisting today, to Ernie Collins and Jamar Johnson from our maintenance staff, and to Rosie Engel-Actor for videotaping this event, which people will be able to access, which is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for people who couldn't come in person. I also want to thank the Cheltenham Area Multifaith Council for co-sponsoring this event, and with special thanks to the outgoing president, Marge Sexton. The Multifaith Council is a nonprofit, non-political organization that was founded right after 9/11. And they have monthly meetings at different houses of worship and at religious institutions, and work with local authorities and schools for the common good. And their sponsorship is very much appreciated. For our format today, the speakers will each give about a 25 to 30-minute presentation, after which you are invited to ask questions or to make comments. And then after the three speakers are done, I will give a brief response representing the Jewish point of view in addition to the speakers that we have. Before I introduce our first speaker, I would like to say a few words about guidelines for interfaith dialogue. In the celebratory mood of the Pope's visit to Philadelphia this coming week, this event is really a celebration also of multi-faith understanding. This is not going to be a political debate. We have plenty of those. It's not a forum on the political situation in the Middle East. It's certainly not a platform for accusations about religious hostility in the world. We certainly welcome your comments and questions, but remember that our focus is on positive developments in interfaith relations. So, now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Philip Cunningham. And before I read a little bit about him, I just wanted to take a second to thank Josie Fisher. Josie, if you could just wave your hand there, wave again, yes. I wanted to thank Josie Fisher for being the person who really brought me and Phil together. So thank you, Josie Fisher, I really appreciate that. Dr. Cunningham is professor of theology at St. Joseph's University, and along with his Jewish colleague, Dr. Adam Gregerman, is the director of the Institute for Jewish Catholic Relations at St. Joe's. In addition, Phil also serves as president of the International Council of Christians and Jews. He's also the secretary-treasurer of the Council of Centers on Jewish-Christian Relations, of which Gratz is a very proud member. And he has been a member of the Advisory Committee on Catholic-Jewish Relations for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. He has an incredible schedule. He travels all over the world, and we are incredibly lucky to have Dr. Phil Cunningham today. Thank you.
I was almost wondering if I was in the right place with that glowing introduction. I wasn't sure it was me, but Shana Tova, a few days late. to everyone celebrating the Jewish New Year. I was asked to speak about Nostra Aetate and its significance, and that's a very apt topic, as you will see, because of the visit of Pope Francis that we're besieged with in the media about at every turn. You have a handout which has the entirety on two sides of a page of this document, which really isn't all that long, but its impact belies its brevity. It also serves as a good eye chart test to see if prescription glasses for reading are up to date. So this year marks 50 years since the promulgation by the Second Vatican Council in the Catholic Church of its declaration on the relationship of the Church to non-Christian religions. It's usually referred to by its opening words in Latin, Nostra Aetate, which means in our time. And you can see the first sentence in the handout, in our time, when day by day, etc. So much progress has occurred in interreligious relations between Catholics and members of other religious traditions over the subsequent decades that my students today cannot remember a time that I remember when Catholics needed special permission from their pastor to attend weddings or funerals, even of other Christians. So to go across the street to St. John's Lutheran Church or go to a wedding, my parents would have needed, supposedly, to get a dispensation from the pastor. Or the time when we Catholics prayed on Good Friday for the perfidious Jews, that God would remove the veil from their hearts and the blindness of their eyes, or when Muslims were referred to only as infidels. It is therefore crucial that the Catholic community educate our people about the revolutionary reformation, and I use that word quite intentionally, that Nostra Aetate represents. In my remarks, I'd like to describe the conception and the difficult gestation of this document, outline its theological highlights, and sketch the current Catholic interreligious landscape as it is now during the pontificate of Pope Francis. So 3 parts, very Trinitarian. If Ruth is going to present the Jewish view afterwards, I will not claim to represent the 1.25 billion person Catholic view, but hopefully it's pretty accurate nonetheless. So if the world was surprised on October the 20th, 1958, by the unexpected election after 11 ballots of the Cardinal of Venice, Angelo Roncalli, to be Pope John the 23rd, it was positively stunned when this supposedly caretaker pope suddenly announced on January the 29th, 1959, that he was convening a great council of the world's Catholic bishops, the first such council in almost 90 years. Known as the Second Vatican Council, it would meet in 4 sessions from 1962 through 1965. The documents issued by a conclave of this type are the highest teaching authority in the Roman Catholic tradition, which, as everyone knows, has a centralized teaching authority. And the reason for this high level of authority is because such documents are issued by all the world's Catholic bishops in union with the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. Now, as a Vatican diplomat during the Second World War, Angelo Roncalli had facilitated the escape of thousands of Jews from the Nazis by supplying them with fake baptismal certificates or bogus Vatican visas. His experiences surely motivated him when he became Pope. Only 2 months after announcing this grand council, he ordered on March the 21st, 1959, the removal of the word perfidious from the Good Friday prayer for the Jews. The next year, he greeted a delegation of American Jews with the words, "I am Joseph, your brother," suggesting that reconciliation between Catholics and Jews, something akin to the Genesis reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers who had subjugated him, maybe such a reconciliation was possible in the 1960s. More importantly, on September the 18th, 1960, he directed Cardinal Augustin Bea, president of the Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity, to prepare a draft declaration for the upcoming council that would address the relations between the church and the Jewish people, which had never been done before, by the way. As I mentioned, the process of bringing Nostra Aetate to birth was a prolonged and difficult labor. Despite John XXIII's desires, after all the bishops assembled in 1962 at St. Peter's Basilica, it became clear that there was a good amount of opposition, both from inside and outside the council. Some bishops recoiled at the thought of changing long-standing teachings. Others feared for the safety of Christians in Arab countries. The press offices of various Middle Eastern countries publicly campaigned against any statement that absolved, quote, the Jews of the crime of crucifying Jesus, end quote. That's from a Jordanian radio broadcast. Various procedural maneuvers were employed within the council in an effort to scuttle the document, and on one or actually 2 or 3 occasions, such efforts almost succeeded. Over the next 4 years, the drafts of what would become Nostra Aetate went through various iterations. Eventually, the decision to address Judaism within the larger context of all the world's religions was a compromise that, in a way, weakened the text stress on the unique relationship between the Church and Judaism, but this was necessary in the colorful image of Cardinal Walter Casper, quote, in order to save the furniture from the burning house, end quote. That's how difficult this process was. Nonetheless, its original purpose as a statement on relations with Jews can be seen in the final document that you have before you. The 4th section, which discusses Judaism, is the longest and most theologically developed section of the document. On October the 28th, 1965, it was officially promulgated after a final, overwhelmingly favorable vote of, write this down in case it's on Jeopardy sometime, 2,221 bishops for and 88 against. For the first time in its almost 2,000-year history, a formal council of the Catholic Church had issued an authoritative declaration on the Catholic-Jewish relationship. So let's now turn to the text itself, and I'll quickly highlight some of its significant moves, some of which are almost quaint 50 years later, but they're groundbreaking. At the very outset, note how Nostra Aetate begins from the beginning of begins with the perspective of the whole human family. Just read the first couple of sentences to yourself. This is a departure from typical Catholic ecclesiastical statements, which usually spoke from the vantage point of a community possessing revealed truths that it dispensed then to the rest of benighted humanity. Instead, as you can see, Nostra Aetate, I like to use that for emphasis, speaks from the common experiences of humanity, positioning the Church as fellow travelers with all people toward God. So right off the bat, there's a sort of paradigm shift that has taken place. In the second section, it speaks positively about the religions of the Far East. Note in particular the sentence toward the end of the second section that the Church, quote, regards with sincere reverence those ways of conduct and of life, those precepts and teachings which, though differing in many aspects from the one she holds and sets forth, nonetheless often reflect a ray of that truth with a capital T which enlightens all men and women, end quote. That is unprecedented in Catholic documents. So again, another important turn has occurred. The declaration goes on to say that that though in Christ is found, quote, the fullness of religious life, end quote, it urges Catholics to, quote, through dialogue and collaboration with the followers of other religions, to recognize, preserve, and promote the good things, spiritual and moral, as well as the socio-cultural values found among these people, end quote. Again, we don't have time to give you before and after quotations, but trust me when I say that this is a radical departure from prior tones and teachings that admonished Catholics to avoid religious conversation, if contact at all, with members of other religious communities. Ever since Nostra Aetate, Catholic statements have promoted interreligious dialogue as a high priority. Thus, Pope Francis has said that his answer to most conflicts in the world is, quote, dialogue, 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 end quote. Now, I want to depart from my text just to make clear something. I'm focusing on Nostra Aetate as a Catholic document because that's what it is and that's what I am. But this kind of renewal and reform after the Second World War and after the Shoah was experienced in many Christian churches We'll hear from the Lutheran tradition's transformation or grappling with these questions momentarily. I don't mean to be exclusive and to claim that this is something unique happening in the Catholic world. Now, section 3 of the Declaration, I think it's on the reverse side of your page maybe, toward the bottom on the first side, also for the first time, if only very briefly, speaks in highly favorable terms of Islam, especially for the commonalities it shares with Christianity. It urges Catholics and Muslims to forget past conflicts, the Crusades, for example, and instead to collaborate, quote, for the benefit of social justice and moral welfare, as well as peace and freedom, end quote. Now, as a theologian, I can't avoid making a theological observation, and that is, you might notice that in this section 3, the name of Muhammad does not appear. This absence reflects a theological conundrum for Christians when engaging with the traditions of Islam. Given the centrality of Christ for Christians, referring to another figure as the prophet with a capital P, par excellence, is highly problematic. There are related issues also in terms of how we understand divine revelation, and we can talk about that later if you like. So there's several large theological questions in terms of Catholic-Muslim dialogue that we're only just beginning to scratch the surface of. Nonetheless, section 3 of Nostra Aetate was also a turning point in interreligious relations because nothing with this positive tone had ever been pronounced before. Finally, to turn to section 4 of the Declaration, which, as I mentioned, is the longest and deals with Jews and Judaism. Over the ensuing 5 decades, it has proven to be hugely influential. I'm going to list 7 items really quickly, and if time permits, we can talk about them more in detail. Here's the things that Nostra Aetate did that have had long-standing implications that are still unfolding. 1, it repudiated the long-standing deicide charge. Jews are Christ killers, even though it didn't use the word deicide. You'll see it says toward the bottom of section 4 that, quote, Jews should not be spoken of as rejected or accursed as if this followed from Holy Scripture, end quote, which of course is what Christians had done for approximately 1,800 years. So this is, again, a very significant change. This fact alone justifies calling Nostra Aetate revolutionary. Just that one sentence, I think. Secondly, Nostra Aetate stressed that there is a religious bond and a spiritual legacy shared by Jews and Christians. It talks about the Jewishness of Jesus and his mother and the first apostles. It recognizes Christianity's debt to biblical Israel because the Tanakh, with a different order and sequence of books, is the Christian Old Testament, more or less. And this intimate spiritual connection has been stressed ever since Nostra Aetate, probably most powerfully by Pope John Paul II, now St. John Paul II, also St. John the 23rd, by the way, at his visit to the synagogue in Rome in 1986 when he said, quote, the Jewish religion is not extrinsic to us, but in a certain way is intrinsic to our own religion. With Judaism, we have a relationship we don't have with any other religion. You are our dearly beloved brothers, and in a certain way it could be said that you are our elder brothers, end quote. And this familial attitude or posture has been repeated and reiterated by Popes Benedict XVI and Pope Francis. So this is firmly embedded in Catholic understanding today. 3, Nostra Aetate strongly implied that God and the Jewish people abide in a covenant, which again is a reversal from previous centuries. It cites Romans chapter 11, saying that Jews remain very dear to God. In Pope John Paul II's career, he made explicit this idea of the covenant never being revoked, referring to Jews as, quote, the people of God of the Old Covenant never revoked by God, the present-day people of the covenant concluded with Moses, and partners in a covenant of eternal love which was never revoked. Again, this is any Catholic document that touches on Jews and Judaism today is going to refer to this, and again, this is an enormous change. You would search in vain for anything before that. 4, Nostra Aetate deplored all hatreds, persecutions, displays of anti-Semitism directed against the Jews at any time or from any source, end quote. Now, Nostra Aetate was criticized in 1965 for speaking about anti-Semitism as if it was people from Jupiter who were the anti-Semites, and not turning a self-critical gaze upon the church itself. That process has unfolded in the 50 years since. There's still a reckoning to be had, I think, fully, but I would just point to, as a very iconic moment, again, John Paul was Pope for 26 years, so he had a long time to do things. When he spoke at the Western Wall in Jerusalem in March of 2000, he put a fiddle into the Western Wall, a prayer, which said, quote, "God of our fathers, you chose Abraham and his descendants to bring your name to the nations. We are deeply saddened by the behavior of those who in the course of history have caused your children to suffer. Asking your forgiveness, we wish to commit ourselves to genuine brotherhood with the people of the covenant," end quote. And this was a prayer that had been said roughly 10 days earlier at St. Peter's in Rome during an unprecedented mass of pardon, the confessing sins for the previous 1,000 years. That's kind of unprecedented too. And so you almost have, at the most significant geographic religious spots for Catholics and Jews, the Vatican and the Western Wall, a Pope personally signing, sealing, and delivering this prayer. It's very powerful. I think it is, as a Catholic theologian, I think it mandates the work that I have to do. Number 6, Nostra Aetate called for Catholics and Jews to, quote, "collaborate in biblical and theological inquiry and friendly discussions," end quote. That's why, in my own life, I've been blessed to be able to team teach with many people, including Professor Joe Davis there, including Professor Ruth Sandberg, and I'm really blessed now, as Ruth mentioned, to be on a daily basis working with my colleague, Professor Adam Gregerman. It's because of Nostra Aetate, just pure and simple. And finally, not least importantly, Nostra Aetate expressed no interest in further efforts to baptize Jews. There's a sentence there that reads, quote, more or less in the middle, "Together with the prophets and with that same apostle, the Apostle Paul, the church awaits the day known to God alone when all peoples will call on God with one voice and serve God shoulder to shoulder," end quote. That phrase is a long story behind that one sentence. We don't have time to go into it. But that phrase was deliberately and carefully constructed after there was a public controversy in the media in the summer of 1964 about whether the council was going to urge Jews to convert to Christianity. Today, unlike some Christian groups, the Catholic Church allocates no financial or personal resources for conversionary or proselytizing campaigns aimed at Jews. This has been debated in subsequent decades. I'll just sum that all up by saying Pope Benedict XVI and Francis have firmly resolved the matter, that we just don't do that anymore. Finally, Pope Francis, my third section of comments. He's a pope of many firsts, as we all know. The first Latin American pope, the first modern pope that didn't live through the Shoah, the first pope in centuries who did not choose to live in the lavish papal palace in the Vatican. However, in terms of our discussion here, he is also the first pope whose pastoral formation as a priest and as a bishop occurred after Nostra Aetate, and who, as a result, has had the experience of engaging in theological conversations as an adult, unlike John Paul II, with Jews who have become close personal friends. His commitment to this special relationship is evident not only in the published account of his dialogues with Argentinian Rabbi Abraham Skorka, but also in a recent, what's called an apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, which is Latin for the joy of the gospel. In this, after summing up many of the church's post-Nostra Aetate perspectives, he writes in a personal vein, quote, "Dialogue and friendship with the children of Israel are part of the life of Jesus' disciples. The friendship which has grown between us makes us bitterly and sincerely regret the terrible persecutions they have endured and continue to endure, especially those that have involved Christians," end quote. Very significantly, theological analysis coming up, very significantly, he goes on to emphasize the living covenantal bond between God and the Jewish community that enriches the world today. And here's where you can see, if you compare the words I'm about to read with Nostra Aetate, there's an enormous development that has taken place in these 5 decades. And it's Nostra Aetate that catalyzed that development theologically. but it has gone further than Nostra Aetate could possibly have done in 1965. So listen to what he says. Again, from a Christian point of view, this is remarkable. It may seem not remarkable from a Jewish point of view, but for Christians it really is. Quote, God continues to work among the people of the Old Covenant and to bring forth treasures of wisdom which flow from their encounter with his word. For this reason, the church is also enriched when she receives the values of Judaism. While it is true that certain Christian beliefs are unacceptable to Judaism and that the church cannot refrain from proclaiming Jesus and Lord as Lord and Messiah, there exists as well a rich complementarity which allows us to read the texts of the Hebrew Scriptures together and to help one another to mine the riches of God's Word. We also share many ethical convictions and a common concern for justice and the development of peoples, end quote. Now that assertion, that claim, that realization, if you will, that Jews and Christians can learn about God by studying their texts together, that's another step, right? And it's very profound. Jack, you may want to throw that image up now if you don't mind. This perspective is the basis for a new sculpture that will be dedicated this coming Friday at St. Joseph's University. After hearing a keynote address by the Pope's friend, Rabbi Abraham Skorka, who will be speaking at St. Joe's on Friday, I mentioned that to you, we will unveil this sculpture, I'm sorry for the fuzziness, it's a low resolution image, by a local artist named Joshua Kaufman, and the title of this sculpture is Synagoga and Ecclesia in Our Time. Synagogue and Church in Our Time. And you get the joke, right? In our time, those three you'll recognize, okay. Synagogue and Ecclesia, this statue speaks to the new relationship of friendship between synagogue and church. Unlike medieval depictions, which are all over the place on medieval cathedrals in Europe, which depicted this feminine pair with the church as triumphant and victorious and powerful, with synagoga bent over and blindfolded and a Torah scroll falling from her hands, our image is showing the two of them as chavruta partners, as study partners, learning from one another's experiences of God. This is the way in which the new relationship between Jews and Catholics, I think, will continue to deepen and grow in the future. It's also a model for all interreligious relationships. And there's my last comment. If Christians and Jews can begin to develop friendships of mutual enrichment and collaboration after about 1,800 years of hostility and estrangement, then this gives tangible hope to other interreligious conflicts, most of them of much shorter duration, by the way, that afflict our world today. Thanks very much.
It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Pastor Linnea Clark. She is the newly ordained pastor at St. John's Lutheran Church, right across the street from Gratz. And when I say newly ordained, I mean as about a week ago, a week and one day. So it's a yes, she's a great applause. Linnea is a native of the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts. She holds a Master of Divinity degree from Yale Divinity School and Yale's Institute of Sacred Music. Amazing. She has contributed to ecumenical and multi-faith cooperation through her work with the Yale University Chaplain's Office, Multi-Faith Hospital Chaplaincy, and the Delaware Interfaith Resource Center. Pastor Clark is also a musician and a liturgical composer, and I think at least one of your compositions was used at your ordination. One or two? Yes, I think, right, yes, okay. She also writes liturgies and music for congregational use. And I wanted to thank her so much for taking the time from her new position to speak to us today. Pastor Clark.
So I just wanted to remind you that I'm speaking today not as a scholar, but as a clergy person and as someone who works with Lutheran congregations. I've done some work on Reformation era liturgical change, and in the process of this, did not uncover some of the things that I'll be talking about today. I'll be talking about some really difficult topics, particularly the anti-Semitic writings of Martin Luther, the person who Lutherans claim as their founder and their big inspiration. And this will be news to some of the Lutherans in the room, I think. Most Lutherans don't know these things, and if they know them, they don't know the extent to which they've been taken, especially in the 20th century. So as we begin, I first wanted to situate Lutherans in the Christian family tree. We can have that, it's probably the next slide up. Thank you. So Lutherans are on this is a huge oversimplification, but Lutherans are on the Protestant side of Western Christianity and are descendants of Catholics. They are part of what we call mainline Protestants today, as opposed to evangelical or free denominations. And they are descendants of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. On the next slide, you see an overview of the current existing Lutheran denominations. These are the big ones. My denomination is the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which has just under 4 million members. There are also the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod with about 2 million members, the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod with about 1 million members, and some other assorted smaller flavors of Lutheranism. My denomination is generally the most socially progressive one. It's also the only American Lutheran, major Lutheran denomination in the US that ordains women, which is why I'm here today. So we can have the next slide. Thank you. This is Martin Luther updating his blog. And this is the only humorous slide because it's not going to be humorous later on, so we had to get it in while we could. Lutheranism, of course, has its roots in the German Reformation. Tradition attributes its beginning to 1517, when the German monk Martin Luther posted 95 theses, or discussion points. Tradition says he nailed them to the door of the cathedral church in Wittenberg, Germany. And these listed some of his grievances and some things he just wanted to talk about the way the medieval Roman Church was teaching and conducting itself. In particular, he was objecting to the practice of selling indulgences, of kind of paying to buy your way out of a few years of purgatory. Luther himself was a deeply troubled person. He felt that he was incredibly sinful. He went on a long pilgrimage to Rome. He confessed daily, sometimes several times a day. He fasted, he punished his body, and he never felt that he was free from sin. And these experiences that he had, coupled with close biblical study, particularly the book of Romans, led him to the conviction that human beings are saved by faith alone, not by their actions, and that there is no way we can merit our own salvation without Jesus. So eventually Luther, who was later ordained a priest, left his monastic life. He married a former nun, and he wrote and published prolifically. This was the time of the printing press, so there was a new medium available to disseminate his message. He published on liturgical changes, new theology, on new understandings of the sacraments of the church, and was excommunicated eventually for departing from church teachings, and for a while he lived under the threat of death. But by the time he died in the mid-1500s, the German lands, the Holy Roman Empire, were divided between the Roman Church and Luther's so-called Protestant Reformation. He had never intended to start a Reformation or to separate himself from the church in Rome, but this was the result of his work. He leaves a legacy of sermons, of pastoral work, of writing for lay people and scholars, devotional work for use in the home, biblical commentary. He worked on a new German vernacular translation of the Bible. He wrote hymns and music, and he wrote German language liturgy for worship. So the particularly Lutheran flavor of Protestantism eventually predominated in many German regions, particularly in parts of Eastern Europe and in the Scandinavian countries. So shortly after this, beginning in the late 1600s, early 1700s, Lutherans started coming to the US in a couple different waves of immigration. They came before the Revolutionary War, then they came in the 1800s, the late 1800s and early 1900s, along with many other European immigrants. And for a while they had kind of an uneasy place in the American religious landscape because their style of worship, which looked kind of Catholic, most Americans associated with European immigrants from poorer parts of Europe, but at the same time they were also Protestant, which to many American Protestants gave them a little more legitimacy. This was at a period when Catholicism was not looked on kindly in the US. So while they didn't face the nativism and the discrimination that Catholic immigrants from Southern Europe usually did, Americans were also skeptical of them. So during World War I and World War II, Lutherans felt that they were pressured to prove that they were not Germans, that they were not the enemy because of their association with immigrant cultures. And around this time, you start to see American flags popping up in the worship space in Lutheran churches. We can move to the next slide. So although it was never Luther's intention to form a new church, Luther himself was not a very moderate person. He viewed the world as a battleground of extremes, of a battle between God and the devil. And sometimes this produced profound theological insights. At other times, this led him into fanaticism. Luther published writings against followers of the Roman Church, particularly clergy and the papacy and the church leadership, with superfluous scatological metaphors, hellfire, calling them deserving of violence. There are tremendously vivid woodcuts from this period. He also published writings against local peasants who had been using his ideas of Christian freedom and the priesthood of all believers to resist the wealthy landed classes. And so Luther published a rebuke of the peasants, which caused wealthy landowners to crack down on them violently in the Peasants' War in 1524 and 1525. He also published writings against Muslims. At this time, the Turks were actually gaining territory and moving closer to Europe, so Islam seemed to be a real threat to Europe's identity and existence at the time. But most noteworthy for their length, their volume, and their violence are Luther's writings against the Jewish people. There have been many attempts to explain away Luther's views of the Jews and Luther's writings. Some have said that his latest writings, his worst writings against Jews, were influenced by his old age, but actually he wrote like this throughout his life. Some have said that, well, he never actually called for physical violence against people, but he came pretty darn close enough. And some say that these writings just don't fit with the rest of what he's written, but as we've seen, it's close enough to his writings against Catholics that this is not a huge departure. One theory is that Luther had hoped that what he called his purified form of Christianity would inspire Jews to convert spontaneously, and when this obviously didn't happen, he didn't understand why and reacted angrily. We can have the next slide, thanks. Luther's most noteworthy anti-Semitic pamphlet was published in 1543 called On the Jews and Their Lies. It's not his only writing about Jews, but it's the most well-known. His program that he presents in this document, which historian Heike Oberman calls a pogrom, refers to Jews as children of the devil. It calls for people to burn down synagogues and Jewish schools, to destroy Jewish homes, and to allow Jews to live in shacks and stables instead. It calls for people to confiscate and destroy Jewish religious writings, to forbid rabbis to teach and preach, and to forbid them safe passage on the roads. It prohibits money lending and calls for the confiscation of Jewish wealth for safekeeping, so-called, to be returned upon conversion. And it encourages Jews to earn a living instead through hard labor. Luther writes, as all can see, God's wrath over them is so great that gentle mercy will only make them worse, and harshness little better, so away with them at all costs. The irony is that for much of his career, Luther actually had a reputation as a friend of the Jews because he affirmed the Jewishness of Jesus and the value of the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament. Even to the end of his life, he preached what he called tolerance and harsh mercy, which were the only options available to allow for conversion. As bad as this is, as awful and horrible and shameful as this is, it actually stops short of traditional medieval thought, which called for the outright killing of the Jewish people throughout Europe. This is not an excuse. It does not mitigate Luther's ideas. It merely demonstrates how terrible conditions were for medieval European Jewry. Luther was convinced that he was living in the last days, that the apocalypse was coming, that he had to defend the gospel at all costs. Note that his view of the Jewish people is not solely as a religious group, it carries racial connotations as well, which is typical for the medieval period. And later it resonated with the Third Reich's concept of the Jewish people as a race in the 20th century. We can have the next slide. Few Lutherans know that Luther's anti-Semitic writing provided fertile ground for the Nazis. Luther's work may not have directly laid the groundwork for Nazi anti-Semitism. It's highly unlikely that Hitler himself ever studied Luther, but it provided an all too convenient source to legitimize it. And it is part of the anti-Semitic European legacy that ultimately gave rise to the Nazis. Before the Second World War, the Third Reich already started to capitalize on Luther Day celebrations throughout Germany. And on these occasions, they raised up Luther's writings against Jews. First edition prints were displayed at the Nuremberg rallies. And parallels between Luther's program of pogroms and the Kristallnacht were unavoidable. Some German Lutheran leaders began reprinting Luther's writings at this time, and others supported Nazi policy of requiring Jews to wear yellow star badges, calling this part of Luther's request for harsh mercy. And some Nazi leaders with Lutheran church connections portrayed Luther as the spiritual ancestor of Hitler. You can have the next slide, thanks. I do want to raise up the work of a few, not known at the time, well known now, a few Lutheran leaders, German Lutheran leaders, who risked their lives and their freedom to bring down Hitler and the Third Reich. These were people who had been working as spies kind of on the inner ring and who knew from their positions the full extent of Hitler's final solution. Most notable was Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was eventually imprisoned and executed for his involvement in plots against Hitler. Note that Bonhoeffer and like-minded leaders also grounded their opposition to the Nazis in their uniquely Lutheran flavor of Christianity. Bonhoeffer recognized his own complicity in the oppression of European Jews because he was a Christian and a Lutheran. Today, neo-Nazi groups, the KKK, and other anti-Semitic extremists continue to keep Luther's anti-Semitic legacy alive, which is something else that contemporary Lutherans don't really know. So we can have the next slide now. So the question becomes, how do Lutherans come to terms with this history, and how do we respond? By the last quarter of the 20th century, Lutherans around the world acknowledged that it was well past time to address Luther's anti-Semitism and all of its deadly consequences. In the 1980s, the Lutheran World Federation, which is kind of a collective group for Lutherans around the world, made it the first steps towards seeking penance and reconciliation. And in 1994, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, my denomination, published its declaration of the ELCA to the Jewish community. This document takes an attitude of confession and penitence with no expectation of easy forgiveness. So here is a lengthy excerpt. It's actually not a very long document. In the long history of Christianity, there exists no more tragic development than the treatment accorded the Jewish people on the part of Christian believers. The Lutheran communion of faith is linked by name and heritage to Martin Luther, teacher and reformer. In the spirit of truth-telling, we who bear his name and heritage must with pain acknowledge also Luther's anti-Judaic diatribes and the violent recommendations of his later writings. And we express our deep and abiding sorrow over its tragic effects on subsequent generations, grieving the complicity of our own tradition within this history of hatred. We express our urgent desire to live out our faith in Jesus Christ with love and respect for the Jewish people. We recognize in anti-Semitism a contradiction and an affront to the gospel, and a violation of our hope and calling. This document is revolutionary because it expresses deep grief over generations of violent effects of anti-Semitism on the part of Lutherans, particularly the Holocaust and the Shoah, which occurred in strongly Lutheran areas. It acknowledges that our name, Lutheran, links us to Luther, his achievements and his failures alike. This document also confronts the anti-Semitic nature of Luther's writings without attempting to excuse them, and deplores them, and it also deplores their appropriation by contemporary groups. It acknowledges Lutherans' complicity in the perpetuation, historically, of anti-Semitism. It declares that anti-Semitism is in direct conflict with our faith, and it pledges to work against the deadly violence of bigotry within and beyond our own church. It ends with a prayer for God's blessing on efforts to cooperate and to understand one another across Lutheran Jewish lines. Today, the ELCA has a standing consultative panel on Lutheran Jewish relations, which is part of the denomination's Interreligious and Ecumenical Relations Office. Some publications since this declaration have offered some guidelines for Lutheran Jewish relations. And these are guidelines mainly for Lutherans to keep in mind when talking to Jewish communities. They caution Lutherans that our denomination now rejects laying blame for the death of Jesus upon Judaism or the Jewish people. It warns to avoid stereotyping Judaism as a legalistic religion or by caricaturing it as a result of the portrayal of some Jewish leaders in parts of the New Testament. It encourages Lutherans to understand and respect the depth of Jewish concern for communal survival in the wake of the Holocaust and in the wake of centuries of persecution by Christians. And it encourages Lutherans to base their education and interactions with Jews with real living communities of faith, that this is not an intellectual or an academic exercise. This is real, and it must be lived in all of its messy reality. The end goal is for greater self-understanding and for mutual enrichment, not just for surface tolerance, and to acknowledge the places where we have commonalities. Lutherans also no longer seek the conversion of Jews to Christianity. One of the oldest traditional Good Friday prayers, as we've recently heard, asked God for their conversion, and this prayer no longer exists in our Good Friday liturgy. Now we pray for God's blessing on the Jewish people. The prayer calls them first to hear God's promises, and we respect the Jewish people as our cousins in faith. So there are some challenges remaining today. As you all know, a piece of paper does not fix things. Most Lutherans today remain unaware of Luther's legacy of anti-Semitism, and if they know about it, they probably don't know about its 20th century and contemporary appropriation. There's a tendency in Lutheran churches to elevate our reformer, Martin Luther, to near sainthood. Reformation Day observances in congregations sometimes just turn into Luther celebrations. And before we do things like this, we need to understand the whole person. Another challenge is that reconciliation efforts have not been sustained from an organizational level with quite as much enthusiasm as they were in the past decade, although dialogue with American Muslim communities has increased post 9/11. There is agreement that anti-Semitism is against the teachings of Jesus, but Lutherans and their pastors often have blind spots about how sometimes they might perpetuate discrimination or a dismissive view toward Judaism. One thing that I am working on is to use the term Hebrew Bible in place of the term Old Testament. The term Old Testament suggests that the New Testament came along, overturned it, and superseded it. And most scholars have made this switch. People in divinity school and seminary are starting to make this switch, but it hasn't made it down to congregations yet. Another thing that I also try to work against is using the Hebrew Bible to point to Jesus without acknowledging that contemporary Jewish communities currently read it differently and also read it differently at the time it was written, and that these interpretations have no less legitimacy than ours. There's also a persistent stereotype of the Hebrew Bible as the home of the angry, punishing, or outdated God, which tends to lead to stereotypes of Jewish beliefs as legalistic. And most importantly, sometimes there shows up some supersessionism in biblical interpretation, as if the New Testament now means that all the laws in the Hebrew Bible don't matter, or that now that Jesus has arrived on the scene, the law is irrelevant. This is not true. This is not in keeping with true Lutheran theology, but it imagines that Judaism has not evolved beyond the sects we see portrayed or sometimes caricatured in the New Testament. So current efforts are really about honoring Jewish interpretation and recognizing that we are not the only people who have a claim on this book. I really think that these problems come from a place of ignorance, not a place of maliciousness. But much like white privilege blinds white communities to racism and to the ways they might perpetuate it, I think that Lutherans, and more broadly, Christians' position as historical oppressors requires us to listen and to learn. And I think that care must especially be taken around the holy times of the year like Advent and Christmas and Lent and Easter, when a lot of these supersessionist interpretations of the Bible and the sensitive passages about Jews and the death of Jesus start to show up in our lectionary. So from my perspective as a young pastor starting out, these are goals that I have for myself. These are things that I'm constantly working on. And the educational process for these things in a congregation is also a long learning experience. But as our denomination reminds us, this work must be on local, individual levels. And I look forward to, now that I'm in this neighborhood, hopefully working with Jewish communities in this area. And I've been honored to be invited here today.
Well, I also have the distinct pleasure today of introducing Mr. Feyzi Erguren. Feyzi is a native of Turkey and is the outreach coordinator for the Peace Islands Institute. And I just want to make sure that everybody sees the beautiful banner that represents the organization. Peace Islands Institute aspires to facilitate a forum of mutual respect and collaboration, both welcoming and accepting varied viewpoints and voices, with the intent to develop original and alternative perspectives on vital issues that our society is facing, generate solutions to these issues, support successful practices, thus promoting education, friendship, and harmony, and acting as an island of peace for all peoples in a society of different ethnic, cultural, and religious backgrounds. It's an incredible mission statement. As part of his work with the Peace Islands Institute, Feyzi also leads several interfaith trips to Turkey each year. And as a matter of fact, when he leaves here, he was telling me he is going to be on his way to Germantown Jewish Community Center because the people from that congregation are taking an interfaith trip with him to Turkey. And in addition to this busy schedule, Feyzi is also a law student at Villanova University, and he has 2 small children. So again, I want to thank Feyzi so much for speaking to us today. Mr. Feyzi.
Hello. Now, we just had 2 amazing presentations, and I would just like to set the mood by starting off with a joke. a rabbi, an imam, and a bishop walked into a bar, and no, I was trying to think of one. I was, just to get us up, wake everyone up again. I know these are really tough theological and historical issues, and if it was 70 years ago, no one of us would be here in the same room talking about these things, and we owe it so much to the great work that our leaders in our community are doing to bridge this gap. So thank you very much for having us here tonight, Ruth and the Gratz College. This is an honor. My name is, as you heard, Faye Zager, and I was born in Chicago, raised in Turkey. And I'm trying to do some of the things that Ruth talked about. I'm trying to be a father. I'm trying to be an outreach coordinator. But what I would like to just say in the beginning, if it wasn't apparent before, I am a young person. I'm not a scholar of Islamic studies, but I have been fortunate enough to lead close to now 20 trips to Turkey, interfaith and intercultural trips. And in those initiatives and events, we usually have a lot of issues and subjects getting into the interfaith dialogue. And I have learned a great deal about my counterparts and engaging in these talks, and this is something I want to share with you. So I will start talking about the religious aspect of interfaith understanding in Islam, and then move on to the historical aspect of how it was continued, and finally connect it with what is going on right now. So when we talk about Islam, I think one of the main things a Muslim has to believe in, to be a Muslim, is the 5 pillars of Islam. And just namely, the first one is believing in God, only one God, believing in the Creator's angels, the prophets, the books, the Holy Scriptures, and that all good and bad, so fate is in His control. That believing in fate and all good and bad all bad subjectively, I should say, comes from Him. Or I don't want to give any pronouns to the Creator, but that's what I'll just say. But in the Muslims' understanding, so when we start in a way of trying to understand the faith, Muslims start with these 5 pillars, which again comprehensively include all the prophets. So this includes, of course, Prophet Jesus, Prophet Moses, peace be upon all the prophets, all the books, New Testament, Old Testament, the newest one, the oldest one, I don't know, I don't know, again, I'm not a religious scholar, but all the books of the prophets. And in this way, if you don't believe in these aspects of these other religions, you can't be a Muslim. A person cannot come and say, I'm a Muslim, but I don't believe in that there was a prophet named Moses or Jesus, or there was a Bible or Torah. You cannot be a Muslim saying that. So just as a starting point, Muslims interpret their religion first from the Quran, the revelations that were given to, brought down to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon all the prophets again, and his interpretation in a way, or the way he lived it. So all his sayings, all the hadiths we say, the sayings of the Prophet also shaped the religion. And then his close companions, the first rulers of the Islamic empire, you could say, and the latest would be the interpretations. So starting off from the Quran names the Jews and the Christians as the people of the book. So in the Quran, there are many verses that talk about the relations between the people of the book and the Muslims. So they're respected and they're differentiated from, let's say, unbelievers or hypocrites, or you could name your enemy or ally, but they're named as people of the book. And as people of the book, there are very things that connect them to Muslims. So one of the first things I could name as a person who lives the religion now is that we are able to eat what you eat. So for example, Just like we have the kosher dietary restriction in Judaism, Islam has this dietary restriction if it's halal or haram. Normally Muslims cannot eat a meat that's been slaughtered just without any religious context. But if it's coming from a Jewish person or a Christian person, a Muslim can eat that. And I mean, these are just some examples, but moving into the scripture of the Quran, there's a verse that I want to share with you, and I'm going to translate it right out. It says, "We have created you among the tribes and the nations, so that you may come and get to know each other." And this word "know" is not just literally knowing, just learning. So you can't just go on Google and learn about the other tradition. It means to actively go and gather the information, go and physically meet with that other person, or that culture, or that nation. So in that way, dialogue, intercultural dialogue, and interfaith dialogue is incentivized in the Quran itself. Now, of course, the religion of Islam existed in, not existed, but was initiated in the 600s, early 600s. And at that time, there were already Christians and Jewish people already living in parts of Saudi Arabia. So beyond moving from the Quran, I'm just going to give a couple examples in how the Prophet's actions and how he interacted with Jewish people and Christians. So his first interactions with people of different religions were actually with Christians first. Even when he was a young boy, although he did not have any interactions with a bishop or a rabbi when he was young, he was illiterate. I have to note this out. He was illiterate even when he was receiving the revelation. He was not able to write. The first revelation is read to him. And he says, "I cannot read." And then continues, "Read in the name of God." So he's not able to read, but this person is bringing the revelations to the people around him, and then it's written and recorded as well. So just little snippets of information while I explain. But so when he was young and a small boy, he would go out into trading expeditions or trading routes with his uncle to other parts of Saudi Arabia. And one of the miracles in his early days was that there would be a cloud following him wherever he would go. And Muslims hear this narration that from the tradition that there was a bishop that saw a cloud moving with that tribe or the camels or the trading group, and he saw that and he invited all of them to a dinner. And then he saw that the cloud was still with the camels that were left back, and he said, "Did you guys leave anyone behind?" And the Prophet's uncle said, "Yes, I have left my nephew with the camels to look after them." And he said, "What is his name?" And he said, "His name is Muhammad." And he says, "I need to, he says, I need to see him, or I need to get some information about him." And once he gets some information about him, he says, "Do not lead this child into the next city, because people like me who are knowledgeable of the book know the properties that define prophets, and they may see that this person may become a prophet, and that they will find an anger towards him and may kill him. So you should take him back to where you came from." So it's an interesting part. This is, in a way, his life was maybe, at least on speaking subjectively, was saved by a bishop when he was young. And when he first was revealed with some dreams that he would see when he was sleeping, and told about them to his wife actually took him to a bishop that she knew as righteous and that she trusted. And I believe, I'm not sure, and again, this is for the video. Please do not quote me in any articles and studies, and but I'm just joking. But so that bishop was also not a close relative, but an extended relative of the Prophet's wife. So they would go and talk to this bishop, and he would narrate the Prophet would narrate the dreams he would see, and the bishop would say, "One day you're going to become a prophet, and I hope to see that day," etc. So he continues on like this. So he first starts to interact with bishops even before he understands that there's something really epic coming to him. And he gets this confirmation by this bishop in oath. So, these are just some of the things. And after the Quran starts to get revealed, it is known by Muslims that in the subjects that have not been revealed to him, the Prophet would follow closely to what was revealed to the prophets and the religions before him. So if he didn't know something about a specific subject, he would follow the Christians or the Jews. And he would really reaffirm this and say, Moses sent out 12 people on this expedition, and that's why I'm going to send 12 people too. So he would say this too. And it goes on and on, like many examples. So I'm just going to continue with some of the Christian examples of his livelihood and how he interacted with Christians. And then I'm going to move to the Jewish tradition and the people who lived in Saudi Arabia that had interacted with him. And from these interactions, Muslims have to follow the Prophet. They don't have a choice of saying, oh, that was, maybe he interpreted it that way. So what I'm saying is also the religion itself. That's what I'm trying to say. And I will also connect with why it is not represented or being lived in that way as of right now. So I'll come to that in the historical context. So even we hear from, we know from the tradition that even when Muslims heard that the Roman Empire, who was Christian then, lost to the Iranians, the Persians, in a war, they would get sad. They would be sad that because people of the book have lost the war. And then they would be comforted with a revelation that said in the future it would be the Romans who will come to be the most successful from the Persians. And he continues on. One of the very interesting chapters of Islam is, I have to point this out, that the Islamic calendar starts with the Hijr. The Hijr means the Prophet leaving Mecca, his hometown, to Medina, which became the first Islamic city. And it's such a monumental event that the Muslims started their calendar on that event, on the Muslims leaving from Mecca to Medina. But even before the Muslims left from Mecca to Medina, the Prophet had sent his companions to a Christian land, to a Christian ruler. And he said, go to Habashistan, which was, I believe, part of Ethiopia in the historical context, and find this Christian ruler, for his land is safe and he is righteous. And in the message and the letter that he had sent to him, he also said, I'm going to read this. So I confirm that Jesus was the Word that God had forwarded with his Holy Spirit to the virtuous Virgin Mary. And as God created Adam from his hand, he created Jesus with his spirit and his breath. So he sent this letter to that Christian ruler, and he sent his closest companions, even his uncle, he sent to him because he believed in his righteousness. And the Muslims went there and stayed there, actually. And I don't know if we have time, but if we had time, I would show the excerpt. There's a part of that scene, there's a movie, and the Muslims are going in, and the idolatry, the people of Mecca who follow idolatry at that time are trying to get them back to Mecca to punish them. And they have this interaction with the Christian ruler, of which I just talked about. If we have time, I'll just share that video. But for that time being, you have to be patient with me. So there's another aspect of his interaction with Christians, which is really interesting. So the people at that time who lived in Yemen, there was a Christian tribe, a big Christian tribe that were geographically, which is now Yemen. The Prophet invited them to Medina. And they came to the mosque, the masjid of the Prophet. And when their time, so it was time for them to pray. I don't know exactly if it was Sunday or it was another praying tradition in the Christianity, but they told the Prophet that they need to pray, and the Prophet gave them his mosque, basically. He said, pray in this mosque, perform your communion in this mosque. And some of the people there were really surprised that the prophet was going to give this to him, but the prophet reaffirmed this. He said, "Do your congregation in my mosque." And so it's interesting that to think of this today, to all the things that are going on around the world, that a Muslim mosque would be the house of a church or a Christian congregation is almost impossible. But this example is from the prophet, and whether the person I'm talking about right now today, it says, go ISIS or whatever, or they're saying, this is I want to follow democracy. Either way, this is the person they have to follow. This is their prophet. And these examples that I'm saying are sahih. They're not. They're from a specially. There's no doubt in their authenticity. So every Muslim has to believe in these, has to follow these teachings from the prophet. So the first time the prophet engages with the Jewish tradition and the Jewish people is when he goes to Medina. Now, at that time, Medina was mostly populated by Arabs and also Jews. And one of the first things the prophet did was, when he arrived at the city, was to send people of his companions around the city, get the population, who populated the city, what was the population numbers, and get the leaders of the city to come together, sit down, and write a constitution. This constitution still exists to this day. And this is the oldest constitution that is known, that is comprehensive in its concentration in the judicial system, the education system, the finances, and the defense of a city. This is the first constitution that exists. And in that constitution there are 50 sections or articles, you could say. And these articles specifically talk about what responsibilities each tribe member, or I should say each Jewish leader and Arab leader would get. And it says it right there, the Jewish people, on the 25th one actually, it specifically states the Jewish people's freedom of religion cannot be altered. So this is put onto the Constitution. So this is, in his initial beginnings, this is how he started to interact with the people of the book. What I want to also say is he did not just say, okay, here's the Constitution and that's it, but now they work together. As I said, the judicial system, education, these are the 600s. The finances and defense. So if there was, and by the way, in terms of defense, many people picture the prophet as a man who's only a commander and would go and show the sword and say, you're either with me or you're dead. But actually, all of the wars that he took part in were all defense wars. So never did the prophet go into another nation or city and say, we're going to get you. You're the next city, we're getting you, either you're Muslim or you're dead. Nothing like that. All of them were defense wars that Jews and Arabs partook in that city, in Medina. And out of 23 years of his prophethood, only 13 hours were battles. 13 hours, this was a research done, only 13 hours of his whole life were spent in a war. So that's just to point out that. But interestingly, one of the people he left his armor was his Jewish companion. A person who was Jewish, the prophet left his armor to a Jewish person. And this was actually for a pawn, as a pawn. So he bought some things from the Jewish businessman, and he gave his armory to him for basically like a deposit or a pawn. And those armies stayed with that Jewish person all his life. Only after the prophet died did the companions went to that person and said, we would like to buy his army back. So they gave whatever he asked for and they bought it back. So these are just a couple examples from the prophet's life. And again, we started from the Quran, the people of the book, and moved on to the Hadith. This is how the religion of Islam is interpreted. So this is how I wanted to move forth. But then there are the righteous companions. There are the four caliphs, we say the rulers of the Islamic Empire after the Prophet, and how they acted. And one of the interesting chapters in that is the name of him is Omar. Omar, he's one of the caliphs. He's the second caliph after the Prophet passes away. And when he's going to Jerusalem to sign a pact, a peace pact, they give him the keys of Jerusalem. And the bishop, the Christian bishop in the city of Jerusalem, tell him, or ask him, I should say, if he would like to pray in their church. And then he says, I would not like to, because if I pray in your church, I would be afraid that the generations in the future would turn it into a mosque. And one of the first things he did when he went into Jerusalem was that he saw shackles. He saw like these bricks and things that were broken, and he said to the people there, "What is this?" And they said, "This was a synagogue." He rolled up. I mean, I don't know. I shouldn't make up this. He didn't roll up. I don't know if he rolled up with his arms. Probably that he started working on the repair right then. He said he heard that was a synagogue. He started to rebuild it, to repair it right then, to give the message. So this is what happened immediately after the Prophet. But again, you could hear you could hear the sense of even from this companion that there might be something happening in the future. There's not a trust in that. I mean, there's a worry because we're all people. We have our fallacies, and even for that, they were acting cautiously. So why is this not existent today? Why don't we have these examples in this time that we have? And what's going on with these extremist minorities in the Middle East? Doing the total opposite of this. So this is where it ties into a bit more close to history for us. And I would like to put this in a context. If we could call, of course, I'm gonna just put another bullet point in there. You guys all know the Spanish conquistador, when the Jews were rooted out from Spain with Muslims, and how the Ottoman Empire took them in. And there's a beautiful museum in Turkey that I went many times. I was just there a couple weeks ago, actually. And it's the quintessential museum, the 500th anniversary of the Jews coming into the Ottoman Empire, and the rulings of the sultans, you could say, given by the imams, what kind of authority they had in the judicial system, in the parliament that opened up in the mid-1800s, and that continued on. It's a beautiful museum, and there's the first ruling of the sultan when the Jews come up from Spain is, how does that person who takes these people out of his country call themselves smart, while all these artists and workers will be the richest of my country? So he sees them as richness, that it would enrich his empire. So there was this beautiful ruling, and of course I could go on and on about this, but when you go on to Turkey, Turkey is very historic. It has more Roman ruins than Rome. It has more Greek ruins than Greece. And what happened, the events that took, 2/3 of the events that partook in the Bible happened what is now in Turkey. And I was just in a biblical trip 2 weeks ago in Turkey, and we went to the 7 churches of Holy Revelation. And they're all there. The churches are there, the cities are there. Some of them are thousands of years old, the cities. And you could see that this was seen as a richness. This was all preserved in such a magnificent way. Hundreds of years, at least more than at least 600 years. So this is part of that culture, to preserve the tradition of other religions. But unfortunately, it's not the case right now in some extremist minorities. So why is this? How do we see this? if we could call these last 2 centuries anything of the Islamic tradition, we could call them the Dark Ages. So, as I just pointed out, the Ottoman Empire, a 700-year empire that had ruled with different traditions, different religions, in all parts of its spectrum, and he would literally send out rabbis and bishops to inspect the Jewish and the Christian communities if the Christian and the Jewish law was being applied. So this was that kind of a meteocracy that existed at that time. But at the fall in 1914, the starting of the First World War, a map was drawn by the British of the Middle East, given to a family of the countries, Syria, Iraq, were given to a family, and whatever that family's siblings remain today remain. And basically that empire was collapsed. And of course this wasn't happen out of the blue. In that empire there was a lot of loss for the respect of tradition, respect of religion, the century before that. But what I just want to give an example is this. Turkey is just one of the few, if not the only country that was colonized after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. One of the few Muslim countries. And let me just give you a couple examples of how Islam is lived in Turkey. So just coming back a couple, 5 years ago, if you wore a headscarf in Turkey, you would not be able to get a college education. Let alone, actually, you would not be able to walk into a university campus if you wore a headscarf. This is Turkey. I'm talking about 2009, 2008. Headscarf. Still to this day, if you wear a headscarf in Turkey, you can't be a judge. In the early 20s, there was a big change in many Muslim countries. And I could give, because I have a Turkish background myself, I could say this directly. Thousands of imams were hanged in the 20s and the 30s, simply because they didn't shave their beard or took off their turban. Reading the Quran in Arabic was illegal for decades. The azan, the call to prayer, that would be chanted from the minarets of mosques, was disallowed in Arabic for 18 years, for more than 18 years. So you could see, in the beginning of the last century, all the Islamic leaders, the scholars, the tradition, was to be destroyed. And this was done in many countries. Turkey is a country that was not colonized, by the way. So I mean, it's one of the better off Muslim countries in the Middle East. And even with that, you see the stark history. We don't know this much in our Western tradition. We don't know this history that after the First World War, what happened in the Middle East exactly of those Muslim countries. We don't hear this too much. But it's the reality. And from this leaderless, and I also, by the way, the alphabet had changed. So this was different to Turkey, but some other countries, Muslim countries as well. The alphabet was specifically changed from Arabic alphabet to Latin, and no one right now in Turkey is able to read any works that date, more than 70, 80 years. They're just not able to read it because nobody knows how to read it. Only some scholars, and those scholars are. Let me tell you, they did not have the Islamic leaders or the imams or the Islamic scholars to interpret them. So all of this is the reality of what we see in Turkey today. And of course the Middle East. So from that, ignorance pops up. Ignorance comes up to the stage. And what we call ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whatever Islamically affiliated organization or terrorist movement you could name, has ignorance in the root of it. The ignorance in its root. So that's what we see in all these extremist minorities that are coming up in these days. The destruction of churches, synagogues, moving away from, executing, you name it, and it's just not the way it's represented in the tradition. It's totally, there's a disconnect. And we could talk about this hours on, what's the motivation and things like this, but I just want to give you that context so that we could judge what's going on right now in the Middle East from at least a close perspective of what the people see within those regions. But is there hope? Of course there's hope. When people see leaders that are taking a moderate stance, that are taking these traditions into their core teachings, people do follow. And I just want to speak just a couple minutes about one of those leaders who's named Fethullah Gulen. He was named Time Magazine's top 100, one of the top 100 leaders, influential leaders in the world. He's a pioneer of interfaith relations in the region. He was the first Muslim leader in the region to visit Pope John Paul II, meet with the chief rabbi of Israel and Turkey, and the Orthodox leaders in Turkey. And he is known by the world to lead a movement in education. So he teaches in his writings and sermons about helping the community no matter what the tradition or no matter what the background. And this was a movement that started in the 70s, early 70s, and now they have thousands of schools around the world in 170 countries. So 170 countries, thousands of schools inspired by this Islamic scholar. It does exist. And he's just this year he's been giving the King Ikeda award from in Atlanta, Morehouse, just this year. So he's pretty well known. That's what I'm just trying to say. And I'll just finish it quickly right now because I'm getting out of time. So we are one of the organizations. We're an intercultural and interfaith think tank, Peace Island Institute. And there's a video about what we do. So I'll just give you an idea of how some of the things that started in the 70s, 80s translate into a local think tank here in Philadelphia. And get your questions afterwards. Hopefully I didn't confuse you too much, but I'll try to clarify anything, starting with the joke and the questions. Thank you.
We are almost out of time, so I just wanted to take just a few minutes to respond to the three speakers that we had the privilege of hearing from this afternoon. So, as we have clearly seen today, Christians and Muslims have done and are continuing to do a great deal to better interfaith relations. So a question that I have to ask myself as a Jew is, so where do Jews stand in this effort toward improved relations with the Christian and the Muslim world? And I think, to be honest, I think the Jewish response has been slow and very tentative. And that is understandable in a post-Holocaust world. However, there have been a few efforts that have begun within the Jewish community to address the issue of what exactly is the relationship between Jews and their Christian and Muslim fellow human beings. I did want to bring to your attention a document in the handout which is known as Dabru Emet, which means speak the truth, and you can find it on page 3. This is a document that was written in the year 2000, so it's starting to get a little dated, I would say. Yes, and it was signed by over 200 Jewish scholars and rabbis, and it contains 8 statements in which the people who created this document wanted to find 8 ways, 8 connections between Jews and Christians. And as far as I know, we do not have a comparable document showing 8 connections between Jews and Muslims. And I think that should be one of the efforts that the Jewish community needs to think about. In terms of Dabru Emet, I'm just going to read the 8 points. They start on page 3, and they are highlighted there for you. The first one is that Jews and Christians worship the same God. 2, Jews and Christians seek authority from the same book. 3, Christians can respect the claim of the Jewish people upon the land of Israel. 4, Jews and Christians accept the moral principles of Torah. 5, Nazism was not a Christian phenomenon. 6, the humanly irreconcilable difference between Jews and Christians will not be settled until God redeems the entire world as promised in Scripture. 7, a new relationship between Jews and Christians will not weaken Jewish practice. 8, Jews and Christians must work together for justice and peace. There's been a lot of debate among Jews over this document, which is not a surprise because Jews can't agree on almost anything. But at least this was a start. So I would like to conclude our discussion today with reading another statement that was written by Dr. Cunningham's colleague, Dr. Adam Gregerman. Adam Gregerman makes an important and vital statement about the next step Jews need to take in interfaith relations. And I think that his words can apply not only to the Jewish relationship with Christianity, but to Islam as well. So if you could just turn to page 5, I'd like to end with Adam's statement. In the future, I would like to see Jews move beyond the tendency to being only spectators when it comes to developing relations with Christians. Jews have generally been content to watch Christians change their teaching on Jews, but not enough Jews have been committed to widely disseminating these changes in the Jewish community. Few Jews have engaged seriously in the study of Christian texts. I would like more Jews to be religiously affected by the positive experience of engagement with a religious other. I know there are obvious reasons for this reluctance, but our shared scripture and deepening friendships make it possible for Jews to glean new insights from Christians. For instance, Jews can learn from the moral challenges of New Testament teachings, from rigorous Christian ethics, and from the impressive Christian commitment to others in Christianity at its best. There is also the value the Christian tradition places on inclusivity that stems from its strong sense of spiritual community, whereas Jews often self-define in more ethnic or national terms. These are features of Christianity from which Jews can benefit. Well, I think Adam says it all. I think it's a great way to conclude this event. I wanted to first thank all of our speakers this afternoon for taking time out from their very busy schedules to provide us with such important teachings. And I also want to invite everyone to join us for kosher refreshments downstairs in the lobby. And I also wanted to let you know that flyers are available for our adult education program, which starts this fall. Thank you very much.